All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. And welcome to our third and final webinar in our three-part series featuring the work of Barry Goldstein and Veronica York. Today, they will be covering the topic of the high cost we pay to tolerate domestic violence. My name is Ashley Rumschlock, and I am the National Director at domesticshelters.org, which is a program of Alliance for Hope International. I'm joined by Hannah Craig, our Director of Content, as well as our Senior Digital Services Specialist, Rachel Myers. Hannah and Rachel will be monitoring the Q&A and chat and providing behind-the-scenes supports throughout today's webinar. This webinar is being presented, as you heard earlier with that video, by domesticshelters.org. And today's presentation is part of our ongoing free webinar series. Check out the Watch Webinars section of the website to see more of our past webinars, including the first two of this series. You can receive a certificate of attendance for past webinars by emailing us at domesticshelters@allianceforhope.com. domesticshelters.org is a program of Alliance for Hope International where we focus on creating communities of safety, hope, and healing. You can check out allianceforhope.org to learn more about the Alliance's other programs and access our library of professional resources available to you. We do have live closed captionings for today's webinar, to enable click show captions, and then a transcript will also be available within a week of the presentation. This is a Zoom webinar, so we've got listen-only mode. Please use the Q&A box for questions. That just helps us to make sure we don't miss anything. The chat can go by really fast, so we want to make sure that if you have a question, it does get to the presenters, time permitting. And then we will be in touch within a week. We're going to email you a certificate, the transcript, the recording, and any resources that are referenced throughout this presentation. Our presenters today are, as I mentioned, Barry Goldstein and Veronica York. For those of you who weren't able to attend the last two presentations, which we highly encourage you to watch the recordings for, I'll just share a brief bio for both Barry and Veronica. Barry Goldstein is a longtime friend of domesticshelters.org and a member of our editorial advisory group. With 42 years in the domestic violence movement, he's an author of 6 books. He's an expert witness in 31 states, co-author of the Safe Child Act. His upcoming book, Preventing Domestic Violence and Child Abuse, co-edited with Therese Hannah and Veronica York, will be published soon. Veronica York is a domestic violence author, speaker, and expert witness in child custody cases. She's qualified in 10 states. She's a partner at Goldstein & York, co-owner of York Consulting and Family Services, and a certified high-conflict divorce coach and family law mediator. As a survivor herself, she's passionate about reforming the family court system and training professionals on domestic violence's impact. Welcome, Barry and Veronica. We are so glad to have you back, and we'll allow you to take over the screen, turn your cameras on, and we're just excited to dive into this final presentation. Welcome.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so I want to thank everyone for being here today. Again, as Ashley said, for the final of our 3 webinars that we've been doing for domesticshelters.org. Prior to this presentation, the last couple of weeks, we did a presentation about the link between domestic violence, smoking, cancer, and heart disease, and how preventing domestic violence can save millions of lives and trillions of dollars. We also did a webinar about how current family court practices, particularly in contested child custody cases, are increasing domestic violence homicides because of the practices, outdated practices that they still currently use in these cases. With those 2 webinars, we just want to thank all the positive responses that we've received from those webinars, and we are honored to continue this series with this last webinar that we're going to do today, which is the high cost we pay to tolerate domestic violence. We recognize that the human cost obviously is the most important in domestic violence, and we're going to talk about that in our presentation today as well. However, we do want to address the financial costs that society endures when we tolerate domestic violence. And again, with the video you saw prior to this webinar starting for domesticshelters.org, domestic violence obviously is much more than just physical violence, and it takes a toll on society. But the financial cost, we think, is important to address because it can help society make the needed reforms, particularly when we talk about how the financial costs are really a burden on each and every American in our country. We are going to address that by a lottery ticket that you'll see later on in our presentation. And this is meant to provide a little bit of humor to this really painful topic. We find that adding a little bit of humor here and there helps us all kind of keep going when we're talking about these really painful things that we have to endure when we tolerate domestic violence. So we do intend after this particular webinar to continue to have follow-up programs, possibly even trainings to help domestic violence advocates become expert witnesses like what we do. And so we just want to encourage everybody that this isn't, when we say this is our final webinar and it's just in this series, we will continue to provide information and education and ways that we can actually make action steps to prevent domestic violence and to help particularly protective mothers in child custody cases when abusers use the family court system to continue their abuse. So with that all being said, I'm Veronica York, and Barry Goldstein is going to tackle the next slide.
Welcome, everybody. We want to talk about the fact that the harm from domestic violence has always been understated. And in different areas, that's true. For decades, domestic violence advocates have talked about the fact that the physical abuse, the immediate injuries, are usually not the worst part of domestic violence. And courts and other professionals did not listen to the advocates because there wasn't research to support it. They didn't have fancy titles after their names. And worst of all, they were just women. And then the ACE research came out, and it said everything the advocates had been saying is true, that the fear and stress from living with an abuser is what causes most of the harm. And we wish that not only would everybody have understood what ACE is saying, but that it would have been a confirmation that when it comes to domestic violence, we need to listen to domestic violence advocates. The same minimization occurred in terms of the health costs related to domestic violence. For many years, if you looked for research about the health costs of domestic violence, you would have seen something in the area of $5 to $8 billion. But those calculations were only looking at the immediate physical injuries. And then when I was working on my Quincy book, I found a study from the Academy of Violence and Abuse, a medical study. And based on that research, they found that the United States was spending about $750 billion a year on health costs related to domestic violence. And keep in mind, as ACE tells us, that fear and stress creates health problems that last a lifetime. But we now have more advanced research. As part of the research for our book, we have a chapter by a pediatrician And they found a research that found that, in fact, the health costs are now, I'm sorry, the total costs are now $3.6 trillion. That's right, trillion with a T. And that's 2014 dollars. So it's actually more. And one of the things about statistics is that domestic violence is the most underreported crime. So whatever numbers we're using are usually less than the full harm. So it's important to understand that. We also see that, and what's really important is victims and children often cannot reach their full potential because of their exposure to domestic violence and child abuse. And that's a huge break on our economy, because we're not creating everything we can. Often we have to provide services to people who otherwise would be contributing. So that's really important. The other thing is domestic violence causes more than just domestic violence crime. Um, Many of you are familiar with the original Quincy model, which was the first really successful effort to dramatically reduce domestic violence crime. And the district attorney, Bill Delahunt, believed that if he could reduce domestic violence, he would reduce all crime. And that's exactly what they accomplished. And other communities that have used best practices have been similarly successful. And so we know this can be done. And the last thing I want to just emphasize, as Veronica said, we know the human harm is the most important issue. But we've been talking about that for decades, and it hasn't gotten public policy where it needs to be. And we're thinking that this new research about the financial costs might make a difference in getting policymakers to take domestic violence more seriously. If they're not concerned enough about the direct victims and other victims, at least maybe they'll do it because as a society, we pay a huge financial cost, and everybody is harmed when men abuse women. Veronica?
So I'm going to get into a little bit of the financial costs that Barry's talking about, and that number has we found come up to $14.1 trillion, mostly about domestic violence and tolerating domestic violence. And what we found is we talk about the ACE research a lot, the adverse childhood experiences, which is medical research from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And for each adverse childhood experience a child is exposed to, they get a score of 1. So they can have a score between 0 and 10. And just for some context, if a child has an ACE score of 6 or more, on average, they lose 20 years from their life. And what we have found is that I'm going to go through the 10 ACEs of this from the CDC research. And we found that each one of these 10 ACEs can be caused by domestic violence. And we think that's very significant because the opposite is not true, meaning that these abuses do not cause domestic violence, but domestic violence does cause these abuses. And so as I go through each one, we're going to talk about how domestic violence can be a contributor to each and every one of these types of abuse. So the first one, emotional abuse. We often hear courts talk about domestic violence and they talk about physical violence, but they fail to understand the impact of how domestic violence is an emotional abuse of the children. And so when we talk about emotional abuse, we want to make sure that we're including that when an abuser hurts a mother, he is also hurting the child. That is emotional abuse of that child. When we talk about physical abuse, obviously domestic violence can cause physical abuse. Not all domestic violence has physical abuse. And I think when courts don't see any bruises, when they don't see any physical abuse, that is something that they try to use as a non-probative factor to disbelieve true reports of true domestic violence. But when we talk about physical abuse, we know it's harmful, but it's not what causes the most harm according to the ACE research. We know that what causes the most harm in domestic violence is the stress and fear that abusers cause. And so that's what I wanted to point out with the physical abuse. Sexual abuse is an ACE, and we see sexual abuse in child custody cases where a father has sexually abused a child. And we know that sexual abuse was the cause of the unscientific alienation theory, parental alienation syndrome, and back in the 1980s with Richard Gardner, who concocted that because he was working with abusive fathers, particularly child sexual abusive fathers who wanted to gain custody. And so, sexual abuse is very much a power and control tactic for abusers. And again, can absolutely be caused by domestic violence. Emotional neglect, same thing. When you have a narcissistic parent, when you have an abusive parent, emotional neglect is very prevalent, particularly in child custody cases. When abusive parents will emotionally neglect their children in order to hurt the other parent as well. Again, physical neglect is caused by domestic violence. We see abusive parents will withhold food as a way to control. They will withhold hygiene products, even feminine products from younger children, girls who are going into puberty, things like that. They will withhold medical care as a form of power and control. So obviously, physical neglect can be caused by domestic violence. Separation of the parents. Obviously, victims will leave their abuser when they are able to safely get away from that abuser. So separation of the parents is definitely caused by domestic violence. And domestic violence itself is an ACE, right? So when we talk about domestic violence, we're talking about all the types of tactics of domestic violence, particularly coercive control. And again, when we list domestic violence as an ACE, we are definitely talking about coercive controlling tactics as well. Mental illness. Again, mental illness does not cause domestic violence, but domestic violence can cause mental illness. And we see this with victims who suffer post-traumatic stress disorder. They suffer mental issues because of all of the stress and the fear. And they have symptoms of PTSD, things like that. So mental illness certainly can be an issue and can be caused by domestic violence. Substance abuse, we see this again as a cause of domestic violence because victims sometimes will use substance abuse to cope with the severe abuse. With physical abuse, they can use, medication and things like that when they're trying to get through and forget about the abuse or self-medicate, things like that. So substance abuse can absolutely be caused by domestic violence. And then death, obviously, incarceration of a parent. Abusive parents can be arrested and put in jail for perpetrating domestic violence. Obviously, there's homicides and suicides that are associated with domestic violence. So as you can see, all 10 adverse childhood experiences can be a product of domestic violence, and we think that's highly significant when we're talking about the cost that we suffer, each and every American, at the hands of domestic violence perpetrators. And again, not just the financial cost, which is up to $14 trillion, but also that human cost we were talking about earlier. Barry?
Okay, just to answer one of the questions in the chat box. When we talk about $14.1 trillion for ACEs and the 3.6 trillion for domestic violence, that's an annual cost. We're spending that every year to tolerate ACEs, to tolerate domestic violence. Now, what we want to do, we put up together this lottery ticket that we want you to have. It's a really special ticket. And we're having some fun with it, but it really makes some important points. And this lottery ticket, the prize is $11,000 per year for life. And we didn't just pick a number. Um, because we're spending $3.6 trillion a year to allow men to abuse women, mostly. Some people have talked about, the gender roles, and, obviously men can be victims, but, in a heterosexual relationships, overwhelmingly it's something that men do to women. And so we want to make that clear. In any event, the 3.6 trillion is about $11,000 a year per capita. That's why we picked that number. So with this lottery ticket, the first thing is the ticket is free. And everyone in your family can have one. So think about, you have a family of four and you're getting $44,000 a year, and that's before you make your own money. I mean, this can be a huge difference in people's lives. But there are additional, really wonderful side benefits in ending domestic violence. The first thing is that winners receive increased life expectancy. There is a huge reduction in cancer, heart disease, suicide, and other diseases. Crime would be dramatically reduced because, as we said before, it's not just domestic violence crime. Children who witness domestic violence growing up are far more likely to commit other crimes. As a matter of fact, the reason that the original Quincy model started was that Bill Delahunt, the district attorney, had the personal records of all the prisoners in a nearby high security prison. And he noticed that virtually all of the prisoners had a childhood history that included domestic violence and very often sexual abuse. And that's why he believed that by preventing domestic violence, he would be reducing all crimes. And finally, in terms of your added benefits from this lottery ticket, is a huge reduction. We're going to cut mass shootings in half. And we say that because about half of the mass shootings are committed by DV abusers. So this is the lottery ticket we're offering you, and we're excited about it because we want you to share in the benefits of ending domestic violence. Because in reality, if we make the changes to reduce domestic violence, we are all going to share the financial benefits in addition to all the other benefits. Veronica?
Okay, so on this slide, we're going to get more into the numbers, and at the bottom, you'll see the reference of where we're getting these numbers. Most of those are from the year 2014, and we may have some updated numbers some other time, but this is the last set of numbers that we have. And so the research, your benefits that Barry just talked about really depends on some of these numbers. And what we want to, and he did mention this, but what we want to be clear about is that the US spends about $3.6 trillion annually to tolerate domestic violence. And 2.1 trillion of those dollars are contributed to healthcare costs. So obviously when you think about it, domestic violence on the physical side is going to cost healthcare issues, but then when you think about all of the coercive control and mental health issues that it also causes, so these healthcare costs can add up quickly to an enormous amount of money that we're spending to tolerate domestic violence. 1.3 trillion is lost in potential. I can't tell you how many amazing women that we speak to every day who are brilliant and smart and have everything going for them. Some of them are doctors, some of them are lawyers, some of them have not finished school because they're not able to reach their full potential due to the daily stress and fear that they live in because of their abuser. And that lost potential is enormous on our society. If you think about how much survivors and victims of domestic violence could contribute to our society in their intellectual capacity, in their advocacy capacity, in just so many other things that they can contribute if they were not having to deal with their abuser on a daily basis, and they were protected and they were meant to feel safe, what they could actually accomplish with because they're not able to do that with that burden on them every day. So that cost is tremendous, and the dollar sign is tremendous. And of course, as I said, when we speak with victims of domestic violence on a daily basis, which I know a lot of you also do, and we see firsthand the opportunity cost that we are spending for these women who are not getting the resources that they need so that they can reach their full potential. Other costs that we are looking at, obviously the cost from ACEs that I spoke about in my previous slide. Crime is about $73 billion that we spend on crime associated with domestic violence. Property damage, I'm sure we've all heard stories about abusers damaging property and doing so out of spite and doing so for power and control. That's about $62 billion worth of property damage that we endure because of domestic violence. And of course, education. There are, as I talked about, loss of potential. There are many victims of domestic violence, survivors of domestic violence, who have not been able to finish their education or already had their degree but are not utilizing it because of the domestic violence that they've endured. So these numbers are actually even likely to be underreported. So I think these numbers are very conservative as to the financial cost that we're spending to tolerate domestic violence. And again, they're also likely lower because these are from 2014 and they don't account for the current inflation, which we all know is crazy. So because these numbers are conservative, because we know they're probably higher than what we know, we really want to focus on how do we mitigate domestic violence? How do we prevent it? How do we keep our society from having to pay these extremely high financial and human costs moving forward? Barry?
Yes, okay. I just want to mention that, if we each had to write a check for $11,000 each year, domestic violence would have been severely reduced a long time ago. But we are paying for it. We're paying for it in higher healthcare premiums. We're paying for it in higher taxes. We're paying for it in other types of insurance payments. And we're paying for it with a huge break on our economy. And when our employers pay part of our health insurance, that means we're getting less salary. My point is that we are all paying for it now, just the way we're paying for it, we're not thinking of it in terms of this is our domestic violence tax. Because if we were paying for it more directly, we wouldn't have tolerated it. So now what we want to do is we want to talk about what is needed so that you can cash your lottery ticket. And the first thing we want to talk about is to create a campaign to prevent domestic violence, just like we did for smoking. And as part of the research for our book, we interviewed representatives from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, because they're the ones that run the ad campaign now. Later, Veronica is going to show one of the commercials that you could see today. And what they did, before they did any commercials for a campaign, they did research to try to figure out how to discourage smoking. And what they found out was telling smokers, hey, you can die, doesn't seem to help because everyone knows that smoking leads to death. But what they found out was that more smokers suffer, and live, but suffer with the consequences of smoking. And so they put on the commercials people who were suffering and who really regretted smoking. And they found that that was more effective in discouraging smoking. So what they told me is that if Congress were to appropriate money to do an ad campaign about domestic violence and child abuse, they would do similar research to try to figure out the best ways to discourage domestic violence and child abuse. And it's not just convincing abusers they shouldn't do it, it's convincing professionals the harm that's involved, the practices that are needed, because we want a community response that discourages domestic violence, just as we did to discourage smoking. The next thing is the family courts have got to stop enabling abusers. And we can't emphasize too much that family courts do not understand the fundamental nature of domestic violence custody cases. These are not high conflict in the sense that both parents are angry and both parents are acting out. What's going on there is that the worst abusers are seeking custody to regain power and control and to punish the mothers for leaving. They believe she has no right to leave him. And the custody court's poor practices are making it almost impossible for victims to escape their abusers. And it has terrible consequences for women and children in these cases, but for all of society. And so any successful effort to cash our lottery ticket has to include reform of the custody courts. The next thing is law enforcement. Everyone knows they have an important role to play. And I think one of the things is they need to understand the nature of what they're dealing with. And domestic violence is one of the most underreported crimes. And even before abusers commit crimes, before they engage in physical abuse, they have usually committed hundreds or thousands of non-physical tactics and incidents. And very often, the first time that they are arrested is not the first time they've committed crimes. But if law enforcement treats them as, well, it's just their first offense, let's give them more opportunities, let's give them another chance, what law enforcement is doing is losing their best chance to make a difference. What we found out in Quincy and in San Diego and in Nashville and in High Point is that by creating accountability, by getting a message out that if you commit the crimes here, if you do it now, there are going to be consequences to the abuser. Because right now they expect to get away with it, and that's why there is so much domestic violence. Finally, the media needs to take a role in ending domestic violence. And in our book, we have a chapter by Jessica Klein, who is a really wonderful reporter who's written some really great articles. And one of the things she talked about in her chapter is using accountable language that so often they make it out as if the crime just seemed to happen, or they'll use language um, that invisibilizes the perpetrator, and we need to avoid that. And we need to understand that reporters are used to trying to tell both sides of the story. But just as there aren't two sides for the Holocaust, it was wrong. Domestic violence is like that also. It's wrong. There's no justification for his abuse. And the media needs to send that message. Very often we'll hear, horrific murders, and the media is talking about, what a nice guy he is and interviewing friends and family, and not understanding that his public behavior is very different than his private behavior. So each of these things needs to be part of our response. Veronica?
So I'm going to continue that conversation a little bit. And if you were present at our first webinar in this 3-part series, you saw me play a public service announcement that was done back in the 1960s to discourage smoking. And these PSAs are paid for by Congress to prevent and discourage smoking. And we feel like we could, as a society, have them do the same thing for domestic violence. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a commercial that is current, that the Center for Disease Control is presently doing. And as Barry mentioned before, the PSA I played in our previous presentation was really to try and prevent smoking. And this one is really showing the consequences of not preventing smoking. And so I'm going to play this and we'll talk a little bit more about it.
I was diagnosed with throat cancer from smoking while my kids were very young. I still wanted to do all the same stuff that my dad did with me, like taking my kids fishing. So I take the pole in one hand and the reel in the other. I still haven't figured out how to have a conversation and fish at the same time.
You can quit. For free help, visit cdc.gov/tips.
Okay, so as you can see, the message has really kind of shifted from preventing to, okay, now what are the consequences if we don't prevent, if you continue to do the same thing that we were just trying to discourage you from before? And so living with the consequences is something the CDC feels like maybe will help prevent others from starting in the first place. And we think this is a really good way to approach domestic violence. And if we had public service announcements like that one that's related obviously to smoking, but for domestic violence, what might that look like? What might we present in that type of platform to society to help them understand the consequences of domestic violence, and then hopefully prevent domestic violence from happening? I don't know the answer, obviously, to that 100%, but we think it's worth a conversation. The other thing we can look to in society are medical professionals to help educate the public. And medical professionals are often on the front lines if they're responding to domestic violence calls, or victims of domestic violence are going into their medical professionals when after they've been abused, whether it's from physical injury or whether it's from emotional harm or post-traumatic stress disorder type symptoms from that were caused by domestic violence. And we feel like medical professionals have a very big role to play, particularly pediatricians and other medical professionals that deal with children, so that we can, number one, to help save them from the consequences of ACEs by, talking about it early and trying to prevent further harm. And also, medical professionals tend to have a high rate of trust with the public, with people who they see on a daily basis. And so we feel like that's a good part of society to join this fight and to help prevent domestic violence, to educate the public about the things we're talking about today. Obviously, we've talked about the Cancer Society and the Heart Association in taking a lead role in this fight, because again, ACEs, domestic violence, stress from domestic violence, it causes things like cancer and heart disease later in life if that stress is not prevented. And so we believe organizations that are very well, I guess they're very well looked up to, and they have good credibility, that sort of thing. Judges, lawyers, and society as a whole might listen better to organizations like the Cancer Society and Heart Association. So we feel like, as we're speaking with them to take a lead in this, just as they did with smoking, they can take a lead in helping to prevent domestic violence as well. I also want to touch on the religious leaders. Obviously, when you talk about religion, you have many different belief systems, many different types of gender roles in religious, not just in the US, but around the world, obviously. But I think as we're talking to religious leaders, we want to make sure that they are condemning domestic violence rather than blaming victims, rather than encouraging victims to stay in marriages that there is an abuser. That they would be more supportive of victims to be safe, and victims to understand that their safety comes first, their children's safety comes first, things like that. So we really would like to help. And there are really great organizations out there that are faith-based that are working on this as well. But I think we need to, if we're talking about society as a whole, we need to talk about that sect of society as well, because it's a major player when we talk about domestic violence and helping to prevent and support victims. And a couple of things I just want to point out is that when we're talking about this, particularly in a religious setting, I think there is an assumption or belief that fathers need to be in children's lives, or children need both parents equally, even if that parent is abusive. And, that's just not true. What we really want to do is we want to focus on changing abusers' behaviors. And again, this is all leading up to the same thing: in preventing domestic violence, changing abusers' behaviors, educating them about the harm, about ACEs, about the harm that's caused, how it impacts children, and hopefully that information will help abusers to want to change and not continue their abuse. Okay, so Barry's going to sum up some of our presentation today, and then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. Barry?
Yes, we put out, some promos on Facebook, and we talked about how this research is exciting. And someone responded, it's not exciting, it's horrific. And actually, we were both correct. The fact that domestic violence and child abuse are causing cancer and heart disease, that is horrific. The fact that the failure of the custody courts to recognize and respond appropriately to domestic violence is leading to huge increase in domestic violence and homicide, that's horrific. And all the money that is wasted that could make all of our lives so much better, that's horrific. But this research is also exciting. We found this as part of the research for our new book, and we asked domestic shelters for the opportunity to do these presentations because we wanted to share it with you. Because the thing is, so far we have not made the breakthrough. We have not been able to dramatically reduce DV, or when we did, it's been negated by the failures in the custody courts. And so, we think that the connection with cancer and heart disease, and particularly some very supportive statements from the Heart Association and the Cancer Society, that could be a game changer because they'll be listened to more than we are, even though, we think people should be listening to us. The research about the DV homicides, again, it's horrific. But what happens when court officials come to see this, that their practices are leading to more domestic violence homicides? And what if legislators and other people in the community see that and put pressure on the courts to change? We've seen very often when we lobby for reforms in the courts, a lot of legislators feel, well, we just have to listen to the judicial people. Well, that doesn't work if they're causing so many more DV homicides. And of course, with the money, that's even more so because that would change so many people's lives. There should be public officials that would be excited to use that $3.6 trillion both to return money to us and to provide more services. It's an opportunity. And I must say, we have been gratified by the response from you. We wanted to speak to a DV audience. You're the ones who know this issue best. You're the ones that care the most. And we think you're the ones that would understand the importance of the research we have. And we're not stopping here. We would like to continue to work with domestic shelters, maybe put together some programs. I know in one of the prior presentations, we talked about trying to create training for expert witnesses. We want to use this research to change. I'm getting up there and, I really want to retire, but I'd like to retire. What I don't want is to keep hearing the tragic stories that we get.
No, looks like Barry might have froze. So since that's the case, Ashley or Rachel or Hannah, do we have any questions that we might be able to answer?
Yes, and actually I kept hearing Barry, so hopefully everyone else did too. Maybe I just had a different connection. But can you hear me okay, Veronica?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Excellent. Barry, did you have anything else you wanted to add? And Veronica said it kind of froze it a little bit, but I want to
No,
give you.
I think I made my point. I guess the last thing I did want to be clear about is we understand if we make the changes, it's not going to end all cancer and heart disease. It's not going to end all DV homicides. We're not going to get the full 3.6 trillion, but we could get a good chunk of that. That's realistic, and we want to do everything we can to try. And so we appreciate your interest, and we want to continue to work with you to make the change that's needed.
Yeah, well, I agree, Barry. I think we should all we all are working towards the goal of letting you retire, right? So let's all act on all this wonderful information that you've given us, so you can just kind of go and sit on an island with your beautiful dog Annabelle. We do have some questions. So yeah, let's use these last 10 minutes. That sounds great. Let's see how many we can get through. We have 5, and I see Hannah's typing a new one right now. So the first question on here is, so are those costs for healthcare and loss potential, what abusers want to have happen as part of their need for power control to make the survivor dependent upon them? So are the kind of the things that you said, so the cost for healthcare and loss potential, are those what the abusers want to happen? I'm not quite sure
Well,
if does that make sense to you? If not, I'll have Hannah maybe see if she can.
if I understand, the question is, what can we do to stop the abusers so that we don't have the health costs that we have now? And, one thing is to learn from ACE. ACE tells us it's the fear and stress that abusers cause. One of our frustrations in the courts is that the courts aren't thinking that way. Very often they create orders that increase the fear and stress, making things worse. As a society, as courts, etc., we need to focus on how do we reduce fear and stress. As a matter of fact, our favorite question to cross-examine an abuser is, what can you do to reduce the fear and stress in your child and the mother your child depends on? Because we want to focus on that. And in terms of changing abusers' behavior, the research is really very clear. It comes from the Center for Court Innovation, and it says only accountability and monitoring change abusers' behavior. And when we are lenient, when we let them get away with things, when we let them manipulate the courts and all that, we're denying them the accountability that they need. And we're denying the victims the protection that they need.
I'll add too, I don't believe that abusers think about the consequences for their actions so much that they just want that power and control. So if you're a victim of domestic violence and your abuser doing things or asking you or demanding things from you and you're doing those things, then he's going to be okay. It's when you don't do the things, and it can be obviously changing every day, but I guess maybe the answer to that question too, part of it is that they don't think about the consequences for their actions or the cost that it gives society, really, because everything's all about them.
Very true. Next question is, how do you educate mental health professionals who are still using parental alienation as a diagnosis or blame a child's actions on parental alienation? This attendee is a therapist and wants to know what to do, wants to work with her peers to tackle these harmful narratives. So obviously there's other people in the space, and they see through I won't say the word, but she, they, so what can she do to address that?
Okay, if we could, a couple of years ago, we were at a battered mother's custody conference, and we got some exciting news. There was a case out of Oregon where a psychologist claimed that the mother had alienation, or whatever they want to call it, and that psychologist was brought up on disciplinary charges, had her license suspended. And the psychologist tried to claim that there was other research, other parts to the DSM that justified using alienation. And it was denied because the cottage industry that promotes alienation and the abuser rights groups very much lobbied the American Psychiatric Association to include alienation in the DSM-5, and that was specifically rejected, which means that no other language in the DSM can or should be interpreted as supporting alienation theories. The other thing I want to share with you, and maybe this will be the next time we're here, Veronica and I have written an article that is going to be one of the chapters in the new book with a new approach to alienation. And the idea is, I mean, there is such a thing as alienation, but the alienation theories that the courts have been using, it's not supported by any research, so it's unreliable. But the other part of it is that it's biased. They're doing it in a biased way. They're only looking at the mother's behavior. They're not thinking about how does the behavior affect children. They're using gender bias. And so we have a new proposal to approach alienation in a more realistic and evidence-based way. And at some point we will talk more about that, but we're ready for that.
Yeah, and I'll just add that the evidence-based is very important. So when you're talking to other professionals, depending on what state you're on, I mean, we do have the federal cadence law that specifically bans these types of practices that reunification therapists use with the parental alienation theory. And so these practices, such as forcing children into therapy with their abusers, are being banned because they do not work. Asking children to just get over it doesn't work. It just pushes their fear and stress further down, and it's likely to come out later in more harmful ways. So taking a child away from a parent they're bonded to in order to prepare a relationship with another parent does not work. This is being banned in many states because it does more harm than good. So looking at the practices of that therapist to determine are their practices evidence-based, or are they based on these alienation theories that we know do not work and cause more harm than good.
Thank you for that. Very helpful. A few more questions, but I want to focus in on this one just because it's very poignant to what we're talking about today. We're very fortunate to have you all doing this work here in the US, but are you aware of any other kind of counterparts doing similar work in these areas? And we have people from Australia and Canada that people could be aware of.
I would say that this is an international problem. Last year, I had the privilege of doing some presentations in Reykjavik, Iceland, and Copenhagen, Denmark. And it was interesting meeting people there. I did have a chance to go to Australia and speak there. There are some really good people working. I don't want to start naming names because I'll leave out people. Um, I think the professionals in the DV movement understand the problems. The same mistakes that we made here were made there. Um, certainly in Great Britain, they started passing some coercive control laws, and I think that had a lot to do with our friend Evan Stark, who unfortunately recently died, but his influence, I think, was really important in getting that there. And there's a lot of good experts who were working on the issue of coercive control, and we really appreciate their work.
Yes, and Barry and I have done a couple of presentations from Canada, or virtual, but for Canada. We just did one actually on the alienation chapter that Barry just mentioned. We just did that presentation for a conference out of Canada, and I believe you can go to that website. So that might be something I can send you, the name of the presenter, or the organization that puts that on.
But yeah, we'll include that in kind of our follow-up resources. That would be really helpful. But we are actually about 30 seconds left here. This flies by every time. But so thank you so much for being here. This has been such an amazing series. I know we've been sharing the feedback with you as we've gone along, so you know just how much everyone appreciates it. And I just want to, take a moment to say thank you to everyone who's attended. And it's just an honor to be in this space with so many people who are doing this amazing work. And I know that the information that we're sharing today in your hands is going to make great change and do great things. So thank you so much, everyone. Again, we'll follow up with an email with the recording and all the things that we promised within 1 week. So by this time next week, you'll have that in your inbox. And yeah, just everyone have a wonderful rest of your week. And thank you so much for being here. Bye-bye
No,
now.
thank you. Thank you so much.